Let's testify tonight.
Oh God, you've done so much for me. I'm grateful and overwhelmed here at your feet. And I could stay here forever, Lord, but you call me to something more. And I hear you say that you have a plan to use every broken woman and man to display just how good you are. We are your living pieces of art. What good does it do to hide away when all of my scars are a picture of grace? All right. So I will testify of the power of God. I will tell the world of the hope I have found. For my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, do you believe it? Has he done it for anyone else? I said, has he done it for anyone else? 'Cause the God that I serve, he's always at work. Has he done it for anyone else? So come on and testify of the power of God. Come on and tell the world of the hope we have found. For our body was broken, our hearts were made whole, and that's too good to keep to yourself. Come on and testify of the power of God. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify your voice. This is my. So I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify. Come on, take it up. Jesus, my champion, the victor of grace, the only one worthy of all of my praise. Yeah. So come on and testify. Oh, somebody lift him high. Come on, testify of the power of God. I will tell the world of the hope I have found. Oh, for my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Sing that. Oh, my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, let's do that right now, Murfreesboro.
And good morning, everybody. Hope you had a good week, at least a week as good as mine, if not better, hopefully better. So I wanted to talk about an old favorite topic, and actually I have my lovely wife to thank for this. Is that there was our church? If you've seen our church's YouTube channel, you probably already know this, but our church live streams our Sunday morning services, and then they usually chop up little snippets of it into YouTube shorts that they put up throughout the week. And this is one that was actually from a month or so ago, but my wife happened to stumble across it. And it was, Corey, our pastor, talking about some biblical principles that, and the thing is that what Corey was talking about was apparently not all that impactful to the one poster, because they decided instead to berate Christians because they deny the obvious teaching of the Bible that the earth is flat. And the reason we deny that is because you can look around and see that the earth is not flat. Um, and it's one of those things that people commonly. First of all, I would dare say this. We'll go through some of the passages that a professed flat earther says are biblical proof texts of the flat Earth, and we'll go through them. Not all of them because they have over 200 in their list, but we'll pick a few and see where the evidence actually lies. Uh, but the thing is that I think that it's kind of funny. There are, a lot of people know of some of the names of the early church writers. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, people like that. And they've heard these names, and they might hear occasionally people cite something that they've said. But a lot of people don't actually know anything about these individuals. And part of the reason um, that I'm mentioning this is St. Augustine's writings, actually. He was one of the earliest writers that we have. I mean, he wrote thousands of sermons, hundreds of books. The man was an extremely prolific writer, and obviously his primary subject was theology. And he had a very interesting take on how to view theology versus what we see in the world. And you would think that, since this is one of the most influential people in all of Christian history outside of the people actually named in the Bible, that, churches, particularly the Catholic Church, um, would be very much attached to what he has to say. But the Catholic Church, throughout history, has done things that are very contrary to what Augustine and Aquinas have said. But the interesting thing about Augustine is that he wrote over and over about how when we look at the world and then we look at Scripture, if there is something that seems discongruent, right? So if it appears that Scripture is saying one thing, but when we observe the actual world, we see something totally different, then that generally means that we're misinterpreting that Scripture. And that we should look at, is there a reasonable interpretation of the Scripture that makes sense? And we also forget, and this is another thing that Augustine wrote about to some extent, is the something that I rail on fairly regularly on this channel, and that is taking a literal approach to the Bible and what that actually means. See, when um, Augustine was very much a biblical literalist. However, what that means is the true sense of the word, which is that you are supposed to try to understand the original intent that the author put forward with the words that they used. And so, this does mean that taking a literal approach can include things like metaphor, hyperbole, etc., because we have to simply examine the text and see contextually whether or not it's. And by the way, the context is not just. We have to take into account historical context because sometimes there are figures of speech and stuff that go out of style, or things that have to do with culture from 4,000 years ago that aren't around today. Jesus uses the metaphor of shepherds and sheep a lot in the New Testament. And unless you happen to be like me and grew up on a sheep ranch, most of that stuff goes right over your head, And so, unless you really experience what it's like to raise sheep, some of what Jesus says in these metaphors doesn't make a lot of sense. However, that's part of the cultural context or the historical context. You also have to take in scriptural context, meaning that what comes immediately before and after, and even sometimes in larger passages, what comes before and after the particular thing that we're trying to interpret. A common, an example that I like to use is that if you look at the Constitution of the United States, it clearly says that the distribution and sale of alcohol is prohibited in this country. And you would say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Prohibition ended a long, long time ago. So what are you talking about? But that's because if you read, I can't remember what amendment it is, but if you read the constitutional amendment that prohibits the sale and transportation of alcohol, that's still in the Constitution. However, because of the nature of a document like the Constitution, there's a later amendment that basically rescinds that prohibition. Well, if you only read the prohibition part, then you're not getting the whole story, because obviously in the United States today, alcohol is perfectly legal, at least if you're over the age of 21. So similarly, we need to look at, when we're looking at scripture, there are times when we'll say, oh, well, clearly this means whatever. And but then when you read the entire passage, you may realize that, oh, no, it's actually making a point that's quite the opposite. And, for example, there are some horrific things that take place in the Bible, um, such as Lot's, man, poor Lot, he got jacked up. But Lot had two daughters, both of which got him drunk and had sex with him on consecutive nights in order to get pregnant. That's in the Bible, right? Horrible story. However, it's not in any way suggesting that that is okay, right? Just because this happened to Lot in this story, it's not necessarily an endorsement of that. Similarly, other things that we get into and argue about from time to time, uh, like whether you want to talk about like slavery, divorce, stuff like that, are things mentioned in the Bible, described in the Bible, even regulated in the Bible, but aren't necessarily endorsed by the Bible. And so we need to be very careful. Polygamy is another one. A lot of people think that the Bible endorses polygamy. But in fact, while polygamy is allowed, as far as it's not against the law of the land or anything, and there are plenty of biblical characters that practiced it all the way back to Abraham, but it's also pretty well demonstrated that every time someone gets into a polygamous relationship in the Old Testament, it ends up being a bad situation over the long run. And so, unless you're reading the context of the entirety of that relationship, you just think, oh, well, Abraham had more than one wife, so it's all good, right? No, you need to read it. So, obviously, this is not going to be a super duper in depth study of every verse that people try to say endorses flat Earth. But I am going to go through a few and try to see, and I haven't looked at this list in detail. I pulled up this interesting list of verses that supposedly prove that the Earth is flat from a biblical perspective. And so I'm going to just start going down the list and looking at them and seeing, okay, is there something obvious, or do we need to dig a little bit deeper in order to find a reasonable explanation as to why the Bible might suggest that the earth is flat? Or does it even suggest that the earth is flat? Or are we reading too much into the text to try and get what we want out of the text? And I think that, unfortunately, is all too common a practice. Is that what we want to do is We see, what we have a goal, prove Earth is flat. And so we try to find verses in the Bible that corroborate this goal. And I think that's unfortunately what we tend to do. Keep in mind that the shape of the Earth has been established as being a globe since about 300 years prior to Christ. All right, just make this clear. 300 years prior to Christ. Despite what a lot of people believe, Christopher Columbus was not trying to prove that the earth was round. If you get your history education from Bugs Bunny, you might believe that. And actually, a lot of people do believe that. That somehow Columbus was trying to prove that the earth was round. No, Columbus was trying to prove that you could have an effective trade route by sailing directly west to get to Asia. He didn't know there was another continent in between Europe and Asia. If America, North and South America, didn't exist and the globe was a bit smaller, his plan would have worked. Um, as it is, of course, he's credited for discovering. I love the fact that they say, don't get me wrong, I'm not a Columbus hater, but I do think it's hilarious that people say he discovered America. And it's like, well, didn't the people that were there before him actually discover it? Like, it's just a thing. Anyway, so let me get this up, share screen, and bring up our Bible. All right. So, um, I already have it here because I knew this was the first one on the list. So, on the list, the first thing on it is that the earth is created before the sun. Genesis chapter 1, and verses 1 through 19. Now, I'm not going to read that entire passage. We did an in depth study of Genesis already. But we know that, the quick summary version, Genesis, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, God creates the universe as we know it. It says God creates the heavens and the earth. That would be the creation of the universe. Verse 3, God creates light. Verse 6, God separates uh, what they call the waters of the sky and the waters of the earth, or the water above the sky and the water below the sky. And keep in mind that the a lot of this type of terminology, like even most flat earthers, don't believe that there is a vault of water above the sky, right? So the this is one of those things that is, when I look at Genesis 1, to me, it's a description of the majesty of God, of the creative power of God, and the authority of God, not necessarily a description of the processes that he actually used in creation. But again, this is taking a literal view versus a literalistic view. Um, Verse 11, he creates vegetation, etc. Um, And then here we go. Verse 14, I think this is what they're getting to, is that he creates the sun and the moon. And so this was happening on the fourth day. Uh, God creates the sun and the moon. How is that possible when the earth was obviously created on the first day, except that earth wasn't created on the first day, it was created on the second? Um, so is this proof that the earth is flat? Well, no, this says nothing about the shape of the earth. Why you would use this as a proof text for the earth being flat, I have no idea. Because you could argue that Genesis chapter 1 seems to violate physics if you have the earth created before the sun. Um, but that doesn't say anything about the shape of the earth, only the relative age of the earth compared to the relative age of the sun and their placements. Um, the thing is that, and again, we talked about this in great detail when we did our Genesis study. There are varying ways to interpret the first chapters of Genesis. Um, and one that I think makes a lot of sense, that explains a lot of the strange things about the first chapter of Genesis when we look at the creation story, is that it's not done as to be a this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It's done in a way, in a system of what you would say a logical format as opposed to a chronological format. And the example that I've heard before that I think works, John Lennox used this, is that if you were to ask a surgeon about the construction of the hospital that he's in, he would say, well, obviously, we have the surgery center right here. And to the west, we have the recovery room. To the east, we have the intake. Now, on the ground floor beneath us, we put in a reception area where patients can check in and everything like that. And of course, then on the floor above us, we put a longer term recovery area for people that have surgery that requires multiple days stays. All right, that's all fine and dandy. However, obviously, that description doesn't mean that they created the surgery center floating in the air and then built the wings around it and then built the lobby beneath it and then the floor above it, right? That would be ludicrous to even think that. But that's because that's just how we use this all the time when we talk. We generally don't say things chronologically. We say things logically. You know, hey, I bought a new car. I put it in the garage that I built on the side of the house. Does that mean that I built the garage after I bought the car? No, it just means that I put the car in the garage that I built, right? So we need to be very careful about putting too big of a deal on chronological versus logical. And I think that the interesting thing about Genesis and is that if you look at the first couple of days and then the beginning of the week and you look at the end of the week, it's very interesting how things kind of fall in place. Because on day one, God creates the universe itself. On day two, he basically creates the mass of the earth, the oceans, basically, and separates that from the rest of the universe. On day three, he creates the sky, land, uh, and all that. So then, this is what's interesting. Then we look at the days at the end of the week, and we have on day four, he places the sun and the moon in the sky. On day five, he puts living creatures in the water and the birds in the sky. And on day six, he creates living creatures on the land as well as finally man. In other words, the first 3 days of the week, he creates the places. And on the second 3 days of that week, he populates those places. And they coincide with each other, day one and day four. On day one, he creates the universe. On day four, he populates the universe with things like the sun and the moon and the stars and all that. And so on day two, he creates the the oceans and the sky. Well, on day five, he creates the fish and the birds that populate the ocean and the sky. So you can kind of see how that works in a logical format. But irregardless of all of that, and yes, irregardless is a word, nothing about Genesis 1 1 through 19 describes the shape of the earth. All right, next one, that the universe is complete. Genesis 2 1. That doesn't even make sense to me, but let's read it. So, Genesis 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. Yes. Does that say anything about the shape of the earth? I don't think so. But hey, go figure. So I don't think that one needs much exploration. I mean, I just think that calling that anything about the shape of the earth doesn't make a lick of sense to me. So now let's get some interesting stuff here. Job is the next one on our list here. So we're going to go to the Job 38. Now, what it's saying here, as far as their proof, is that the earth's measurements are unknown. So, Job 38, verses 4 and 5. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? Okay, so call me crazy, but these, I'm sorry, but so far this list seems to be completely crap because there's nothing about this that suggests that the measurement of the earth is unknown. God is simply challenging Job. If you read the story, it's actually very interesting. But God is challenging Job when Job dared to question God's plan. It's like, where were you when I made the earth? You think you're all that. Do you, were you there when I marked off the dimension of the earth, when I laid the foundation of the planet itself? No, obviously the answer is no. But it's not about the fact that it's unknown. Now let's take a look. There's actually two other verses they use to say that the earth's measurements are unknown. The next one is Jeremiah. Uh, let's see. There we go. Jeremiah 31:37. So let's go there. So Jeremiah 31:37 reads, this is what the Lord says: only if the heavens above can be measured and the foundation of the earth below be searched out, will I reject all the descendants of Israel, because all they have done, declares the Lord. Okay. Now, this is an interesting one in that it does kind of make a little bit of a claim as far as the extent of human knowledge, in that, but not in the way that I think the people that wrote this list are looking for. It says only the heavens above can be measured. Well, to this day, we cannot measure the size of the universe. We can, in fact, the best we can do is in what we declare as the visible universe, because what is beyond the visible universe, we don't know, because it's not visible to us. Um, we can speculate based on what we know of the universe around us, but we don't really know what's beyond our ability to see. So, which is something like, I don't know, 13 billion light years or whatever it is. Um, and so when we try to see anything beyond that, we just can't, not yet. And even if we could see a little bit further, well, then what about beyond that? What about beyond that? Will man in a practical way ever be able to truly measure the entirety of the universe? Probably not. Now, the other part, though, is a little more localized, as the foundations of the earth below be searched out. Now, that reads to me, and I could be wrong, but that reads to me as if when man would have explored the entirety of beneath the surface of the earth, right? So, uh, which right now we can't do even if we wanted to. They tried. It's kind of funny. A lot of people know that there's this hole that they dug in Russia that's like this really super deep hole, and it's like the deepest hole ever drilled. And it's not as deep as they wanted it to be, primarily because as they were drilling, the temperature down there got so hot because you're getting closer to the mantle, the temperature got so hot that the drill bits just would literally melt. And so there's no way to basically continue drilling at that point. So it will probably, will man ever be able to even truly explore the depths of the earth? Probably not. Because if there's, assuming that our current theories on geology and stuff are true, and that the Earth has a molten core of primarily iron, there's nothing that we're going to be able to build realistically in the conceivable future that would be able to probe that. All right. So next up, there's one more verse for the measurements of the earth unknown, and that is Proverbs 25. So let's go there. See if we have a little bit more luck finding something that actually says what they claim it does. 25 verse, let's see. Let's see, Proverbs, we want 25, and then verse 3. As the heavens are high and the earth is deep, so the hearts of kings are unsearchable. Well, again, I don't think that this is saying that the dimensions of the earth are unknown as much as that you can't probe to the center. There's no way, at least with our limited abilities, and probably for the foreseeable future of mankind, there's no way to actually probe into the center of the earth. So, as the heavens are high and the earth is deep, so the hearts of kings are unsearchable, because you can't search into the center of the earth. And you can't probe to the highest reaches of the heavens. You can't go as far out into space as there is space, because we can't even see it. So nothing here to me would indicate a flat Earth, and it doesn't even indicate that we don't know the measurements. All right. So next up, this is probably where we get into the real meat and potatoes of flat Earth arguments. So the next section, it says there's two verses that show the Earth is a disc or circle, not a ball. And so we'll go to the first one is Isaiah. And it is Isaiah 40. And by the way, I'm perfectly willing to be convinced otherwise. But unless, it's going to be very difficult unless Scripture specifically says, oh, by the way, the earth is a flat surface, and don't be fooled by people that tell you it's a sphere spinning in space. Uh, you know, Unless it says something like that, it's going to be very difficult to make your case here. But okay, so the Earth is a disc or circle, not a ball. This is he sits enthroned above the circle of the Earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. Um, and now I think that's an interesting one, but let me ask you. So the fact that it says above the circle of the Earth, if I was to say the circle of the moon or the circle of Mars or the circle of the sun, um, none of that is inaccurate in that if you look at the moon, it looks like a circle. And if you're on the moon looking back at the Earth, it looks like a circle. And so I don't know if necessarily this is describing that the Earth is a disk as much as that it is round. Um, but let's go to the other one that's supposed to be the killer in this particular one, which is Job again. And this is 38 verses 4 and 5. Um, it's this, wait, Job 38, oh, 13, 14, sorry. Um, Okay, so that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it. The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. So, um, I think that this is a better one if you're going to try to make your case, um, because it does describe taking the earth by its edges and shaking the wicked out of it. Um, Now, the thing is that I would look at again, if we just go back one more verse, it starts off this whole section by saying, "Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it?" Um, it's not speaking in what you would say literalistic terms, right? Obviously, God is not suggesting that you literally give orders to the morning. The morning isn't even a thing. The morning is a time of day, right? So how could you give orders to the morning or show dawn its place, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense from a human standpoint. But the point of this is God's um, sovereignty over the universe as a whole. I don't think necessarily as much about the shape of the earth. Now it says, does it that might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked off out of it? Well, let me ask you this: if that's meant to be taken literal, right? That you can take the edges of the earth and shake it. Okay, so I will accept 100% that that is a literal path. If you're a flat earther out there, hear me out. I will take that 100% as literal as soon as you show me how the morning and or the dawn, because they're kind of the same thing, um, how they have arms to grab the edges of the earth and shake it. I think that this entire passage is meant to be taken as metaphor and nothing more. But at the same time, you know, people want to make everything extremely literal. Now, the next part, the earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. Um, the interesting thing about that, so that doesn't really talk about the shape of the earth as much as the topography of the earth. That is saying that what you would see is like mountains and valleys and all that would be like how you press a seal into clay, which if you don't know how seals would work back in the day, most of them were actually discs. You think of like a signet ring as, but that which is a form of seal, but most of them they were like a disc, and you would push the disc over clay, and that would imprint the clay with whatever is on the disc, right? And so, or not disc, but like cylinder. And so obviously they're not trying to argue that the Earth is cylindrical, um, but this is simply describing that the Earth, uh, with all of its grand mountains and deep valleys, is from God's perspective is no more than clay under a seal. Right? It's not trying to be literalistic that the Earth's surface was literally smashed out by a giant seal that God ran across the surface of the Earth. So yeah, boy. Then we go back to earth measured with a line, not a curve, and that's Job 38, verses 4 and 5, which we already read those verses. Why they list them twice, I don't know, but where were you and I lay? So, what they're talking about specifically is right here. Who stretched a measuring line across it? Now, here I think people, I mean, honestly, this is just people not understanding, you know, basic geometry. Yes, the surface of a curved three-dimensional object like a planet can have a line on it. And in fact, The interesting thing is that if you look at what we now know about, as far as what we believe at least as the nature of the universe, when we look take into account relativistic gravity, that in actuality the universe or the space itself bends whenever there's mass, and that's what creates gravity. In which case, a straight line would appear curved, because even though it's a straight line, if space is bent, then the line curves, and that's what you're. And so the surface of the Earth, a straight line would curve around the entire surface of the Earth, just like in orbital mechanics, something that anybody who you know works with satellites or has ever been interested in space travel would already know. Um, when you look at the ISS in orbit above the Earth, it's always traveling. It's traveling in a straight line. It's falling, in fact, towards the Earth, but it's also moving fast enough to where the speed counteracts the falling. And so, even though it's falling basically across the surface of the Earth. And that's what an orbit more or less is. And so, as far as it's concerned, it's moving in a straight line. But because gravity around the Earth has bent time space to such an extreme amount, then its straight line follows a path around the globe. So, nothing there that I think is a problem. All right, so we'll just do one more section because this is, to me, so far these are a whole lot of nothing burgers. But then again, this is very typical of flat Earth theology, which is that you take things that are extremely vague or things that have nothing to do with the shape of the Earth at all, and you try to mold it into this case for a flat Earth. But let's see. I'm trying to find a good one. There's paths are straight, not curved. Uh, but again, that would fall into the same thing as far as a measuring line as opposed to a curve. Um, let's see. Waters have a face. Well, and it's looking at like Genesis 1, verse 2. Like God hovered above the surface of the waters, which would be, in some translations, the face of the waters. Stuff like that. That seems like a bit of a stretch. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of verses from Deuteronomy, Samuel, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Isaiah that suggest that the earth has ends. Now, I'm not going to bother reading those because I will concede that there's lots and lots of references in the Bible to the ends of the earth. The interesting thing is that that's an expression that's still used fairly commonly to this day, where somebody might say, "Oh, I've explored to the ends of the earth." That doesn't literally mean that you got to the edge of the earth where you might fall off and into the void. Besides that, if you follow flat Earth, that would be the outer rim, which is covered by the giant ice wall and all that stuff. No, when you say the ends of the earth, they simply mean that you've explored as much as there is to explore. The other thing about this type of phraseology, particularly from an ancient text like the Bible, and translating from a language like Hebrew, is that the word earth has multiple meanings behind it, just like, which is true of the English word as well, but we just don't think about it because when I'm speaking to you casually, conversationally, my context makes clear what I'm talking about. If I say I like gardening because I love working the earth, what I'm talking about there is dirt, right? So, but using the term earth for dirt is correct usage of the word, but it is a totally different meaning than planet. Well, in addition to that, earth also means the word translated to earth, I should say, because it's not actually earth, it's what we translate to earth in modern English. It can mean just that, it can mean dirt. It can mean the entire planet. And it also very commonly means the land that you are on, right? So, for example, you'll see in the earliest chapters of Genesis where it talks about, like, depending on the translation, it'll say that God separated the earth or the land from the sea. That the earth is something different than the sea, even though, of course, modern geology, we know that the sea is part of the Earth's ecosystem, right? So the we forget that the word can not just mean globe or disk, if you prefer. It can also mean the continent you're on, it can mean the country you're in, and it can mean soil that you hold in your hand. Any of those things is a correct usage of the same word. And so we need to be very, very careful about the context that it's being used in. And many times when it talks about the ends of the earth, it's usually talking about long travels, or it's it's like, oh, the angels wait at the ends of the earth. It just means they're a long ways away. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're standing on the edge of a giant disk. There's the famous incidents of the sun stopping moving that's mentioned a couple of times in the Old Testament. That one, I mean, come on. Again, we're looking at a document that's not. I'm trying to remember who. I can't remember, it was Aquinas, I think, wrote about this. Is that the Bible was not written in such a way as to confound those that read it. And that includes those that would have read it 2, 3,000 years ago, as opposed to people reading it today. So obviously, if the heliocentric model of the universe had not yet been developed, and in fact there wasn't much thought given into that kind of thing at that point, trying to suggest that the sun is not moving to the people would be insane. So, but you know what? We still say sunrise, sunset. Oh, well, look how high the sun is. You know, look at the moon. Look at the moon as it's rising. Oh, look, the moon is high. You know, we say stuff like that all the time, even though it makes no sense when we if you start to try to overanalyze it, because obviously the sun's not moving around the earth, and the sun doesn't rise in the morning. However, you would absolutely think that that was the case, based on what these ultra literalists are trying to say. All right, so the moon has its own light, is mentioned in Genesis 1:16. It says, now that one I will go to for a minute, because I think this one is again, whoops, Genesis 16, Genesis 1:16. All right, so Genesis 1:16 says, God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser night to govern the night. He also made the stars. Now, if you look at that, you could say, well, yeah, see, clearly it says there's a greater light during the day, the sun, a lesser night during the night, the moon, and the stars, right? He's filling the cosmos. But the problem here is that, again, it's the Bible is not written in such a way as to confuse people, whether it's people 3,000 years ago or people today. And so if you were to sit there and try to explain to someone 3,000 years ago how the glowing light at night is actually reflected light from the sun, that would probably, you know, people that don't think about astronomical phenomenon pretty much at all, that's going to seem pretty weird, right? So I think you get the gist. It's like 99.9%. And by the way, none of this did I search out in advance to try and find the easy ones to find. I just, started going through down the list. But unfortunately, it's just, I think to try and suggest that the Bible teaches the flat Earth idea is just phenomenally ignorant, because the Bible doesn't really teach the shape of the Earth at all. It refers to the earth as circular, um, or round, if you will. It does not refer to the earth as flat versus curved. Um, and I've talked about before, like one verse that a person that I knew who was a flat earther tried to use is I don't remember exactly where it is in scripture, but basically it says that the earth was God's footstool. And the idea there was to say, well, you see, a footstool is a flat surface with legs supporting it, which would be the pillars of the earth and the flat surface of the earth. And I'd be like, okay, great. So if you're going to say that that's a literalistic verse, that when it says that the earth is God's footstool, that it means that extremely literally, it's describing the shape of the earth. Then what about the fact that the verse very immediately before that says that the heavens is God's throne? Does that mean that the universe is literally shaped like a chair? Or that God's domain beyond this universe is shaped like a chair and God sits in it and then he kicks his feet up on the earth? And when he kicks his feet up on the earth, wouldn't that cause massive damage to the surface of the earth? And why don't we see his feet? And by the way, where's this room that has this giant chair and giant footstool? What do we call that? So, yeah. All right, so to the chat we will go. I hope you guys enjoyed my little diatribe about flat Earth. And just that whole thing on Corey's short video just kind of irked me because, you know, I don't think that Christians deny the truth of the Bible when they say that they recognize that the earth is a sphere. Now, look, if you're a flat earther and you're a genuine Christ seeking person, good for you. I think that your theology, or not your theology, but your philosophy on flat earth, I think is dangerous to the kingdom. But I still, if you're a good Bible seeking Christian, awesome. Um, Now you just need to learn to accept the truth. But the if you but if you're a non-believer and you're trying to poke fun at Christians for not believing in a flat Earth, then I'm sorry, but I just don't see it. It's not like, if the Bible actually said, by the way, the Earth is a flat disk, with specific edges and all, to describe exactly what the flat Earthers like to think that the Earth is. Then I would probably say, well, then the Bible is wrong because we can observe the Earth. We can see what the Earth looks like. We've seen it from space, right? And assuming you don't believe everything that you know every worldwide astronom or not astronom you know space flight technology, every single one of them is part of a massive conspiracy to hide the shape of the earth, not to mention every airline pilot and you know uh, and every naval navigator and everything, they're all in on the big conspiracy too, right? Anyway, Schwario saying loves the song. I love that song too. Was there another worship night recently? Yes, there were in fact two. I put up a short on the channel. They did. We tried it a little differently this time. They usually do a singular worship night on a Friday night. And we've been packing out these stadiums, and instead this time we split it into two nights. And so I did send a short when Kyle did Testify, a shortened version of Testify during the worship night. It was a lot of fun, as always. The worship nights are always a blast. Saw a short pop up, but not sure if it was new. Yes, the one. If you saw the short that I posted, yes, it was the clip of the intro song live. Yeah, that was the short I posted. Is there a chat timer on? Oh, not today, but I'm not planning on going for 5 hours. But I don't have a timer going right now. Ms. Moneypenny saying hi. How you doing? I'll try not to spam. Oh, it's all right. Well, if you have something to say, say it. by all means, Stan. Miss Moneypenny getting into her aggressive nature, throwing a wrench at Stan. Hope the concussion is okay. Trustin says, good morning. Well, the Bible was before astronomy, right? Not exactly, no. I mean, what we call astronomy today, sure, like they didn't have, telescopes and stuff like that like we do now. Um, but studying astrological phenomenon was very common back then. It's just that usually it was used for astrology more than astronomy. And then Miss Moneypenny hugging a pepper and throwing wrenches. Oh, wait, is she trying to say hi to my wife? I think that's it. And then she sends a hug to Shwario. Uh, is it in the Bible that the earth was the center of the universe? Not specifically, no. The narrative, and this is one of those things like, a lot of people don't even understand the history of like the Catholic Church and Galileo and stuff and how that all worked out. But if we look at the actual scriptural references, the the Bible is definitely written from a homocentric perspective, meaning that the Bible is written for people, for man. And so the earth, being our domain, is at the centerpiece of the creation story, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. However, nowhere does it say he that the earth is the center of the universe. It doesn't say that the earth is even the center of the solar system. Um, and so I think that people confuse the fact that the story is about Earth with the Earth being the literal center of the universe. That being said, we don't even know if there is a center of the universe, right? If you look at what we can see of the universe, it doesn't appear like the universe has a center. Now, if I would just put this out: if the universe is finite in size, it does have a center. Where that center is, no clue. Maybe the Earth is in the center, maybe it's not. The problem is that because the expansion nature of the universe, whether you were in the center or not, the universe would still look the same as far as the expansion is concerned. So the only way we would know if the Earth is anywhere near the center would be to understand the entire scope of the universe, which right now we don't. We're not even close to that. It was not more of a Catholic church. It was a church thing. The church basically inferred from Scripture that the Earth was the center of the universe, which is, part of the reason that some people like Galileo were controversial. However, honestly, uh, the truth is that the Galileo was not this abused, imprisoned martyr that people make him out to be. And so I think a lot of people think that Galileo, was like tortured and imprisoned and all this stuff. Uh, and the worst that he ever suffered was house arrest, at which time he lived literally in a palace. And so he did not suffer at all. And by the way, Galileo was known to be a complete jerk, which is kind of funny. The more I read about him, the more I like him because he was just an absolute butthead. Um, Now Miss Moneypenny's throwing wrenches at Trustin. It's all just an illusion. Okay. And Stanley asking if he meant life and uh, said all of it. Okay. Uh, I I don't buy into that, but I would love for you to say more than just it's all an illusion. Do you have something to support that? There's my lovely wife saying good morning. Stanley says, and weren't the founding fathers known for brewing beer, etc.? I don't know if the founding fathers brewed beer or not. The Vikings were there before Columbus. Yeah, I believe that Norsemen did reach the United States first, but they didn't colonize, as far as I know. So that's probably the difference. Well, there's a problem right there, isn't there? Haven't we discovered stars are older than? There's a problem right there, isn't there? Haven't we discovered stars that are older than the sun? Well, not only are there stars older than the sun, but the sun is a second or possibly third generation star as it is. Meaning that the sun, the matter that makes up the sun, was already part of a prior generation of stars that at some point exploded and then reformed into the type of star that we currently have. Um, However, depending when you're looking at Genesis, and by the way, I have no problem with exploring astrophysics and stuff like that, uh, because that's what is I think it was actually Augustine that said that science explains how the heavens. Let's see, what is it? Uh, I'm trying to remember uh, how the heavens go, not how to go to heaven, or something like that. So now I'm having a complete blank on it. I knew the quote so well, now I can't remember it. Uh, and let's see. Everything just melts. Yeah, when you dig deep enough, that's true. Miss Moneypenny left for church, so she's not going to throw any more wrenches at people. Trace Zach Daniel says, huh, okay, cool. All right. Um, Heard an interesting detail about the Earth from NDT. I'm not sure what NDT is, but if the Earth, oh, Neil deGrasse Tyson maybe, that if the Earth was shrunken down to the size of a billiard ball, it would feel smoother than the billiard ball. Yeah, I've heard him talking about that too, because we think of these grand, huge mountains and stuff, but we don't realize how small they are in comparison to the circumference of the entire planet. Um, so yeah, that's actually kind of interesting, but yeah, true. The mountains and valleys are so relatively small they wouldn't even be detectable right wherever your finger over the surface. Yes. Um, has chat time limit been turned on? Most of my comments don't show up if I post quickly. No, not that I know of. I didn't do anything. Sorry for spamming. Oh, you're not. Don't worry, you're not in trouble. You'll shut your big mouth. First of all, I don't know the size of your mouth. I've never seen it. And I don't mind you putting stuff in the chat as long as it's not just random nonsense. Or chronologically, the end of the Earth. That's true. I never thought about that. Like, if you think about the end of the Earth, it doesn't mean the end as much as the final destruction. Um, and what was the Christian explanation for solar eclipses? I don't know if there was an official explanation as much because they just said it was the moon traveling in between the earth and the sun. But the if you're talking about pre-Galilean, they would just believe that the moon and the sun. But keep in mind, contrary to popular belief, they didn't think the earth was flat, right? They thought that the earth was a globe, but that the earth was at the center of the universe. And so that the moon was orbiting the earth, as was the sun at a much greater distance. And so every now and then they lined up, and that's caused an eclipse. Um, and same thing with lunar eclipses, by the way. Lunar eclipses work just fine in a geocentric model. Even the orbits of a lot of these other objects that are supposedly orbiting the Earth gets a little funky. But when you, but as far as the geocentricity model, it doesn't have a problem with lunar eclipses. Flat Earth has a problem with lunar eclipses. Lunar eclipses make no sense in a flat Earth model. Solar eclipses you can, I get, sort of explain, but lunar eclipses not so much. Let's see. What about spherical? I'm not sure what you mean. Was the Ottoman Empire God's footstool? Yes, the Ottoman Empire was officially God's footstool. I'm sure God would have a lazy boy built in footstool. Yes. So the earth is the little extending footrest on God's lazy boy. Well, beyond transcriptions of the words of Jesus, any geological description would just be the observation opinion of the writer. Well, there are things like, because if I think that we need to remember the Bible is inspired by God through the Holy Spirit, but not necessarily dictated by God. And I think that's something that people confuse. And so people do write based on their own understanding, but through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Now, the thing about geological descriptions of the earth, there really isn't that much in the Bible. So we take the few verses that they are, we try to, extrapolate way too much. It's like sitting there and, you read a Harry Potter book and you're trying to calculate exactly where Hogwarts are based on the type of mountains or whatever that are around. It's just, you're digging into it more than what the story is trying to tell you. The narrative of the Bible is not about the scientific processes that govern the day to day operations of the universe. Trustin says, "Gotta run. Great live streams. I really like this kind of format. Have a good one, guys. Take it easy, Trustin." And Stan saying bye to Trustin as well. Don't think it worked out well for Galileo. Actually, and that's the thing. Okay, so Galileo, obviously a proponent of the heliocentric model. And I think, was it Copernicus that came up with it originally? I don't remember. But anyway, but Galileo, believed that solved a lot of problems as far as calculating various orbits and stuff. And flat earthers still, they have to look at the pre-Copernican model of the Earth to try and figure out, well, why is it that planets orbit Earth the way that they do, apparently, because a flat Earth model, you kind of got to, because they don't. There are some, I suppose, but most flat Earthers that I've talked to, they also believe the Earth is the center of the universe. That the sun is like a small 25 kilometer object that's like 100 miles or so above the surface of the Earth. Um, they believe all these things orbit around the Earth, and the problem is that their orbital paths just don't work. And Galileo also agreed with this. The orbital paths just don't work. If the Earth is the center of the universe, then something would have to be causing everything to go in these really weird patterns throughout the sky. And so then, but all of those problems go away if you simply move the center of the universe from the Earth to the sun. All of a sudden, all the orbital paths make perfect sense. All of a sudden, and the predictive power, it works just fine. You can figure out when the planets will be in various positions and all that good stuff. So it would seem pretty obvious that the geocentric model was incorrect. But when Galileo published this, um, there was some controversy about it. There were people that, because keep in mind that what Galileo was saying wasn't just the fact that it went against the established theology of the Catholic Church, but it also flew in the face of, what, 1,000 years of known science at the time, and which is basically that, all these scientific theories were built around the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. Um, and so, it flew in the face of all that. And so then he actually got an audience with the Pope on the subject. This is actually kind of interesting. Now, the Pope was actually an old friend of his. didn't know about this until pretty recently when I was actually doing some research on it. But he knew the Pope from prior to his ascension to the papacy. And but he was granted an audience with the Pope, and the Pope basically said that he could publish his theories as long as he also included the caveat that because God is all powerful, he could have created the universe in any number of different ways and still visibly be the same as it is right now. So, as an example of that kind of line of thinking, is God could have created the universe 5 minutes ago, and all of our memories prior to 5 minutes ago is actually just false memories inserted by God, right? That's entirely possible with an all powerful God. It's unlikely, but it is possible. So, um, so the Pope wanted him to include that caveat in it, in that, sure, okay, so here's why he thinks the heliocentric model is more effective, but God, being an all powerful being, could have created the universe any way he saw fit, and we would see it the same way we do now. So he did so. And except that in his book, now his book was written as a narrative, and so it was basically a fictional debate about a real topic. So he had this fictional debate between two characters. One was heliocentric, one was geocentric, and they were debating the topic, and there was a moderator, and the moderator, I believe, if I remember correctly, the name was Petio, which something like that, and it basically means, or it's very similar to the word that you would get for someone who is ignorant or not informed on things. And throughout this narrative that he creates of this debate, the two people were going back and forth, and the narrator, or not the narrator, but the moderator Petio he would say the dumbest things and get the scorn of both of them throughout this debate. And at the end of the debate, Petio, the idiot, the one that is portrayed as being a moron through the entire book, then gives that line that, well, God could have created the universe any way he wanted, and it would still have the appearance that it has today. And so he basically took the Pope's words and put them in the mouth of an idiot. Now, there's nothing, like today, people do deep fakes of Donald Trump every day and post them online, right? That's not a crime. But to insult the Pope like that back then, that was pretty serious. And that's just the kind of guy Galileo was. He was very snarky, very sarcastic, and honestly, he probably got himself into a lot of trouble he didn't need to be in. But he was never imprisoned in the sense that, like, when we think of someone in chains and in the dungeons or something like that. No, the worst he ever suffered was house arrest in a palace, and that, which is a far cry from what. And the reason that there's this myth about Galileo being brutalized uh, is to create this false narrative. There's a series of college lectures I've listened to recently called "Religion versus Science," and it's actually really interesting because he builds this case, and I tend to agree with him that the uh, the entire idea that science and scripture are in conflict is a false narrative. That's not the case. It's never really been the case, but we try to build up that there's this huge conflict, and Galileo is one way that people who try to push forward this narrative try to use, is that Galileo was imprisoned because he dared to believe in a heliocentric model. Well, he was put under house arrest for insulting the Pope, you know, and so the to try and suggest that he was brutalized and imprisoned is an extreme exaggeration. The only time you really get into a genuine conflict between science and scripture, I may talk about this in detail in the coming weeks, but really the only time you get into it is when you talk about uh, the modern fundamentalist young earth creationist type of person who wants to argue against, say, the validity of evolution as a theory. And I think that even that, so you have basically one relatively small segment of Christianity uh, that takes umbrage to a particular scientific theory. Um, and usually it's because they don't there's no nuance to their argument, right? Either they don't understand evolution, or they do understand it but they just deny it because they think that it's contrary to certain things in the Bible if you take it from a literalistic perspective. How could evolution have happened if Adam named all the animals? um, to which I think there's several good explanations for that. And you only need one good explanation for to debunk it as a proof that evolution is false, assuming you're going to say that Scripture is the Word of God. And you can simply say that, well, Adam was shown all the basic types of animals, but he wasn't necessarily shown every individual species. If he did, then he would still be naming them today. There's just too many species out there for one person to just go through and name. However, if he said, okay, that's a dog, right? And okay, that's a horse, and okay, that's, and he just got all the basic types, um, uh, all the basic types of creatures, then the doesn't mean he named every specific one. That's one. Another one, of course, is the idea that the story of Adam and Eve is a parable, that it's not actually meant to be taken as literal history. That's less popular among Christians, but it's certainly an acceptable explanation. Um, and so, and another is that God somehow magically showed Adam all the creatures that would exist on Earth. You know, or at the fact that Adam was at the beginning of human history. What we call the modern evolved creatures of the Earth would have already existed because we're only talking about around 5,000 years ago, and there hasn't been a whole lot of change in the last 5,000 years. So there's several viable explanations. Stan says that's interesting. I didn't really look into Galileo's punishment. Didn't realize he was essentially just put into house arrest in a nice mansion. Yeah, he did not suffer. Anyway, looking forward to more Leviticus. Sounds like it's starting to get more interesting in the early sections of specific instruction for construction and wardrobe. Yes, we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of Exodus or Exodus of Leviticus quite soon here. It sounds like Galileo was perhaps a bit salty. Yes, indeed, he was. And my favorite tiger that's not on a cereal box says Galileo was excommunicated from the Catholic Church for 500 years. As I understand, that means he was in hell for that long. Well, okay, so it depends on which pope you listen to. The very fact that the Catholic Church, and by the way, my mom was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, so I have very low regard for the Catholic Church and their practice of excommunication, because excommunication, you're correct in that basically, if you are excommunicated from the church is literally saying go to hell, because they believed up until I think John Paul II, they believed that there was no such thing as salvation outside of the Catholic Church, even though obviously that's not in the Bible. It doesn't even say in the Bible that there's no salvation outside of the church. It simply says there's no salvation outside of Christ. Now, I think it was John Paul. modified that edict to say, yes, there's no salvation outside of Christ. But the idea of excommunication was, yes, to exclude somebody from the community of Christ and therefore to exclude them from the kingdom of heaven. It was literally a one-way ticket to hell. And so, do you know, if you're a Catholic, if you're a true believer of the Catholic Church, does that mean you genuinely believe that Galileo was sent to hell for 500 years but now got a reprieve because the modern popes realized that, oh, maybe he wasn't such a bad guy, he was just kind of a jerk? You know, I don't think that's how it works. I don't think that the Catholic Church gets to dictate the who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. But their whole process of sainthood and excommunication makes me sick to my stomach. Robert in the house says shalom, shalom, shalom. Says, when I saw your video title, I was like, what? Salty Checker went the Darren Wagner ideology? Well, no, more or less, I'm still the same salty that I ever was as far as when it comes to flat earth. And no, this was not meant as a disrespect to Darren. This had nothing to do with him. I did this because of the comment that somebody posted on one of the shorts on our church's YouTube channel. Um, and while Darren, wholeheartedly disagree with on his flat Earth stance, that's and I will stand by what I've said, that I think flat Earth ideology is dangerous and that it pushes people away from Christ, and that is an absolutely horrific thing to do. You should never uh, actively try to push people away from the kingdom. However, flat earthers don't see it that way. They see it as, well, this is the truth, and this is, so we're going to put it out there. At least the true believers. And then I think there are people, and I've accused Darren of this, and I would stand by it. And so I think there are people out there that simply take the position because they like to argue. And I this coming from someone, I love to argue, right? So I absolutely will sometimes take a position that I might be soft on or whatever, but I might take the position just so that I can hopefully get a good debate going on a particular topic. But I would never do that on matters of what I think are that important, things like theology. And but I do think that flat Earth is straight up dangerous and deadly to people who basically uh, reject the Gospels, not because of what the Gospels actually say, but because they believe that in order to be a Christian, they have to be a flat earther. Just like when you see these young Earth fundamentalists, people will say, "Well, I'm not going to be a Christian if it means that I have to deny obvious truths like evolution, or the shape of the Earth, or the age of the universe, or whatever." And I can certainly understand that. If the Bible flat out said that the universe, and I mean, like, literally said that the universe was created on this date, and the date happened to coincide with 5,000 years ago or whatever, then I would have to say that, well, then I guess that document is incorrect. you know, because the Bible, while is not a scientific textbook, its claims about the universe should be true. And if we find something that we think is a conflict, then we need to look at, are we misinterpreting the scripture? Or is there potential that we're misinterpreting the world? In every single case, I believe that science and scripture are in conflict. One of the two is being misinterpreted. And I think commonly both are being misinterpreted. And I think about, like, even like the nature of the universe. People, um, dark matter is an example of this. I think on the secular side, there are a lot of people out there. I mean, you will see scientists all over the place, pop culture scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson and others, that will be talking about the mysterious dark matter that makes up more of the matter of the universe than even the visible matter that we can see, right? And honestly, we can only see about 5% of the total matter of the universe, because dark matter and dark energy make up the rest. Um, and yet, we can't find a single shred of evidence for dark matter. And what we do is, dark matter is, Dawking's invisible pink unicorn, because they just say, well, it's matter, but it doesn't interact with light. So then it's not matter. No, no, it's matter because it has gravity. Well, if it has gravity, it would interact with light. Yeah, but this doesn't. You know. Um, so, um, and Robert says, just like in the book of Job, Leviathan is a dinosaur, Brontosaurus are one just like. Well, I'd be careful about statements like that, because we don't know what Leviathan is. We only know the term Leviathan. Like, there are some people that believe Leviathan, if it's the one I'm thinking of, that Leviathan is a crocodile. You know, but honestly, it doesn't matter, because that's not the point of Leviathan. The point is God's majesty in comparison to Job. Um, and Stan says it's matter that doesn't matter. But and Ariel says dark matter is real. We learned that on Futurama. Well, okay, so let me get back to, yeah. So dark matter is an attempt to explain an interesting phenomenon when we look in astronomy. And that's where a lot of these theories, like when we talk about astrophysics and some of the theories, it's usually to explain what we can see and to try and come up with a viable explanation for it. That's why, people say theories have to have explanatory power, right? It has to be able to explain how something is. Um, and so, if you look at a galaxy, right? I'm sure you can all picture what the Milky Way galaxy is typically depicted to look like. So you look at a galaxy, and it's like this. Most of them, spiral galaxies in particular, are mostly these swirling mass of stars. The Milky Way is projected to be somewhere, I think, around 100,000 light years across, and composing of, I don't remember if it's hundreds of millions or billions of stars. And and so you look at that and you're like, wow, that's really cool. So what holds the galaxy together? And now, of course, if you're in Star Wars, it's the Force. And the funny thing is, so it may be closer to the truth than dark matter theory. So what Obi-Wan says the Force binds the galaxy together. Well, the problem is that, honestly, what Obi-Wan said is part of the problem, is that when you look at a galaxy and you look at the amount of mass in a galaxy, meaning you add up the mass of all the stars, any potential planets, any black holes, everything that's in that galaxy, and you put it all together, and as far as that massive amount of mass, it's not enough to hold the galaxy together. At the velocity the galaxies are spinning, they should just fling apart. There's not enough gravity coming from the core of a galaxy to hold the arms in place. So it doesn't add up, right? That's where we get dark matter from. Is that okay? So there must be something else out there that is um, that's causing gravity to hold the galaxy together, but we just can't see it. And so, since we can't see it, we just labeled it as dark matter. Um, so it seems pretty simple, right? There must be something there creating that gravity. Except that I think that we forget, and I did talk about this earlier in this live stream. We forget about what gravity actually is, right? Gravity is not a force produced by matter, right? So gravity is not an intrinsic part of matter. Like, this phone doesn't generate gravity. Instead, it's this phone's position in space time that distorts the space time immediately around it. And the effect of that distortion is what we see as gravity. Right? So the more mass you have, the deeper the distortion. The deeper the distortion, the more intense the gravity. Um, and let's see. Let me, and I'm getting to that, Indy. So, say dark matter is real. It makes up 95%. No, actually, no. Dark energy takes up about 70% of the universe. Dark matter about 25% of the universe, and regular matter about 5%. If I remember the numbers correctly. But this is where I'm getting to. So, I don't believe dark matter exists. I don't think there's such a thing. So, again, what is gravity? Gravity is the distortion in space time typically caused by the presence of mass, right? So, um, but can you have gravity without mass? And the answer is, at least theoretically, absolutely. Because if gravity is simply the distortion of space time, all you need to do is figure out a way to distort space time. And the presence of mass may well be the easiest way to distort space time, but doesn't mean there's the only way. And in fact, one thing to consider is when we talk about in relativity, time dilation, right? Fun topic for sci fi geeks to talk about. Um, Time dilation happens under two very different circumstances. One is your relative velocity to the speed of light. And so the closer to the speed of light that you go, the slower you move forward in time, which means that if you make um, a 1 light year trip to a neighboring star and then a 1 light year trip back, but you make this trip at like 99% of the speed of light or whatever the number is, for you, you might have experienced 6 months of travel time, but for the people on Earth, it was 2 years, right? And so, and the closer you get to the speed of light, the more intense that time dilation happens. So that's one way that time dilation happens. Another that people don't even notice or realize or know anything about is your relative proximity to matter, to large amounts of matter, to being the fact that you are in a gravity well on Earth affects how quickly you move through time. And so, if you were to take, and they've done this, by the way, experimentally, if you take an atomic clock at sea level and an atomic clock at the top of the highest mountain, and then an atomic clock and put it on an airplane even higher than that, or an atomic clock and put it on the space shuttle even higher than that, they'll all read different times in accordance to their relative distance to the core of the Earth. So time dilation is affected by your proximity to a gravity well or to your relative velocity through space in comparison to the speed of light. So, um, what's to say gravity, much like time dilation, which is interesting because both are, Einsteinian theories, general and special relativity. But when we look at gravity, what's to say that the only source of gravity is, in fact, the presence of mass? I don't think it is. And in fact, I think because one thing that we have uh, shown, at least mathematically, to be a real thing is gravitational waves. And so, for example, if the sun were to disappear, somebody disintegrated the sun, right? It would take about 8 minutes before the lack of gravity from the sun would affect the Earth. It's not instantaneous. And so gravity does move at less than the speed of light, or c minus whatever. And so gravity does move at a specific speed through space. There are gravitational waves. If there are gravitational waves, then that would mean significant events like supernova, stuff like that, could create gravitational waves going out as well as matter being flung about. Um, So, what's the biggest explosion in the history of history? Would be the Big Bang itself. I know Big Bang's technically not an explosion, but you get the idea. And so, what happens in the if you've ever looked at an explosion, it's actually very interesting. If you like, because doing 3D animation, I've had to like study how explosions work and stuff. And the surface of an explosion is not a flat, for lack of a better term, or a perfectly smooth curved surface. It's like full of like little nodules of stuff exploding out. The plasma of an explosion is like this bubbling mass as it grows exponentially quickly out from its source. And so, if the Big Bang worked in a similar fashion, then it would stand to reason that the besides the microwave background radiation, that the shape of the universe itself would look much like the surface of a pond where that's on a brisk day where it's constantly in a state of flux. You have high points and low points with the little mini waves that are everywhere, and they're constantly interfering with each other and bumping into each other and creating valleys and peaks. So at the peaks, you would have very little matter or none. At the valleys, you would have more matter. And so I think that the reason that we see galaxies collected together is that they're simply in a trough, if you will, a valley of gravity that's left over from the Big Bang. Not that there's some mysterious, invisible, intangible matter that somehow interacts and creates gravity but doesn't do anything else that matter is supposed to do, and that we have no evidence for. So now, I did run this by in a little bit more detailed fashion to a friend of mine who is an astrophysicist, cosmologist specifically, and asked him point blank if I was just being crazy or if this was a reasonable idea. And he said that there's been a number of groups that have done some research on this very idea, but it's not really the topic of choice right now in physics, and so it just hasn't been thoroughly explored. But it is something that's out there that a lot of physicists actually already believe, but nobody's talking about, because it's much sexier for Neil deGrasse Tyson or anybody else to go out there and talk about the mysterious dark matter that we need to go out and explore and find out about. So, man, that was a long thing about dark matter. Ariel says Professor Farnsworth was out of a time. His dark matter engine moved the universe, not the ship. Yeah, and in fact, the funny thing is that the physics of Futurama are surprisingly accurate when it comes to some of that stuff. Also, Bender met a god. Might not have been the god, but it was a god. Actually, according to the storyline from that episode, that was the god that Bender met. It was Yahweh himself, the creator of the universe. Um, Head explodes like in that movie Scanners. Trace says, and what would Neil deGrasse Tyson say to this? I don't know. I would love to talk to him about it, but I'm sure he doesn't have time for some layperson like me. He's got his podcast to do. He'd probably say, fascinating, let's have a discussion about this. Well, I would actually like to hear what his take on it would be. The thing about Neil deGrasse Tyson is, from what I can learn about him, he's not a particularly accomplished physicist. He's just a very good spokesperson for physics. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not trying to insult the man. It's just that his specialty is in communication more than actually, discovering new things in physics. Like when you look at Professor Stephen Hawking, his theories are basically the groundwork for almost all modern black hole theory comes from him. Him and his partner Penrose, I want to say. But when you look at Tyson, it's like you say, well, what did Tyson contribute? Well, he's really good at popularizing it. Ah, yes, I think so. Not sure what you mean there. And then we surf these waves. That would be fun. And Trace saying, yeah. The universe is in Three Stooges smacking each other concept. Got it. Yes, that's exactly what I said. Right, you're describing superposition with ripples on a pond. Um, I'm describing superposition with ripples on a pond. I don't think that we're talking about the same thing there. I just want to make sure that I'm looking at the right thing. Uh, yeah, so yeah, superposition is not at all what I'm talking about. And that's why I just wanted to double check and make sure I was looking at the right idea. So superposition is here's the AI version from Google. Superposition is the principle that a system can exist in a combination of multiple states or values at the same time. It's Schrodinger's cat, basically. It's saying that the cat is both alive and dead until you collapse the waveform and view the cat, which I think is a big pile of steaming stuff. Um, and so, no, I'm not trying to describe superposition with the ripples on the pond. I'm simply describing the typographical surface of a four-dimensional space-time using a three-dimensional model, water. Robert says it's kind of scary when they developed the test of the atomic bomb. They weren't sure what would happen. Some thought the atomic explosion could continue on and destroy the atmosphere. Yeah, although they were fairly certain that wouldn't happen. You're right. Well, it's just like when they fired up the Large Hadron Collider. There was a small concern that they could accidentally create a black hole that would consume either that entire region or possibly the entire Earth. And so, but they did it anyway because scientists will do anything in the name of science. It's funny. You hear, people like oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name. The atheist bulldog that everybody used to like so much before he passed away. Anyway, Christopher Hitchens. Um, he would talk frequently about the horrific, terrible things that people will do in the name of God, and people don't do that in the name of atheism. And so you're right; they do it in the name of science. And don't get me wrong, science has brought us a lot of great things, and I'm all for. I do love science, but science without ethics is a horrifically scary thing, because science without ethics brings us to the horrors that happened in Germany during World War II. A lot of what happened to various people in those concentration camps was due to scientific experimentation, right? Science without ethics brings us to the Tuskegee experiments, right, where they gave diseases to people without their consent or even knowledge, so they could study it, right? These types of things are horrific things that happen in the name of science. And, is it in the name of atheism? No, because science is not inherently atheistic. At least it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be agnostic in the true sense of the word. But religion is not the only reason people do horrific things. People do it in the search for knowledge, and they'll also do it for political ideology. People will do the absolute worst things in the name of political ideology, and that's one of the reasons that I try to point out that as a non-sectarian Christian, I agree that religion is, for the most part, a destructive thing, or at least it can be. Um, I think that we need to be very careful about understanding the dangers of religion and not falling into that trap. But far too many people who call themselves Christians also become extremely religious. And I would say one of the easiest ways to identify a religious Christian is ask them to identify themselves. And if they say, "Well, I'm a Calvinist, or I'm a Baptist, or I'm a Lutheran, or I'm a Catholic, or whatever it might be," um, And that kind of thing. Well, how about just being a Christian? Because you know what? I don't worship Martin Luther. I don't worship John Calvin. I don't worship John Wesley or any of the other founders of the various denominations of Christianity. I worship Christ and Christ alone. And so but Christians do fall into that trap all the time of becoming religious over relational. Music by Brian, 2024, says, as far as an atheist, I agree with what's being said. So far as an atheist, I agree with what's being said. Gotcha. Well, I appreciate that. And I always try to keep an open mind to stuff like, yes, I believe things that atheists might think are ludicrous and silly. And that's all fine and dandy. But we can still have a civilized conversation about it. And I don't, and I generally don't argue theology with atheists. Just so, if you haven't heard me say this before, Brian, I don't generally argue about theological points of Christianity with atheists. Not because I think the atheists are dumb or unintelligent, or well, dumb and unintelligent are kind of the same thing, or ignorant of biblical principles or anything like that. It's simply because that we don't have a common ground there. We need to, if we're going to have a debate about something, we need to have some kind of common ground that we can both appeal to. And we can't when we're talking about the finer points of theology, like, oh, well, the Bible endorses slavery or whatever. We want to argue about that. That's a great argument to have. But it also requires, as a principle, that you establish that, okay, the ultimate arbiter of truth in this discussion will be the Bible itself. If you can't accept that term, then we can't have the discussion because there's nothing to appeal to. And then we have to go to, okay, so what does it actually say about slavery? What does and are we taking it in its proper context? And it was when we talked about Exodus. I mean, like I know a lot of people were kind of surprised as to how clear Exodus makes it that slave rights are every bit equal to freed people rights, but you just have to actually pay attention to what it says. Were you lumping dark matter with dark energy? Only in that the general argument put forth by pop culture physics is that visible matter is about 5% of the universe. About 70% of the universe is dark energy. And the remainder is dark matter. Music by Brian says, I don't think theists are silly. I went to a Christian college for biology. All my professors were theists, and they were brilliant, except for one lady. She was a nut. Well, yeah, I don't. I think that there's a problem that people have where they assume, and I'm not obviously you don't do this, but some atheists and Christians do this too. But some atheists will just assume that the Christian follows a particular set of doctrines that is their like straw man Christianity. And when I say that, I mean like generally young Earth creationist, absolute literalist, all this stuff that is actually a tiny fraction of Christians. And so even many Christians that are young Earth creationists generally aren't hyper literalists. And the funny thing is, nobody is a true literalist if you when you get into the New Testament, especially. But yet they all claim to be. Like they try to say, "Oh well, the Bible just means what it says." Okay, so that means Jesus is literally a door. You Obviously the answer to that is no. Sorry, I meant classical superposition, not quantum superposition. Classical superposition is described as constructive ways, destructive ways, and how they interact by creating crescent values. Gotcha. All right, yeah. So when you said superposition, I thought about quantum, and that to me is a load of crap. Classical superposition that you're describing there, yes, as far as wave theory about how for there's constructive and destructive waves. And so if you have a wave, you have a pattern of ups and downs. And if you put two waves together and they are exactly the same, so they're synced up exactly. So their high points are the same, their low points are the same. Say their sonic vibrations. So if their frequency is exactly the same, then their high points will build together and make the high points even higher. And so that would be a which you would call a constructive wave. A destructive wave is something we use in modern technology all the time. If you have noise canceling headphones, what it does is the noise canceling headphone has a sensor on the exterior of it. It picks up a sound, and then it generates a wave, a sound wave of the exact opposite frequency, so that the low points are its high points and vice versa. That means that the two waves cancel each other out and it becomes almost imperceptible as a sound. And so, uh, I would love to see if somebody could like I suffer from tinnitus. I've had it for a number of years, and it's extremely frustrating. Extremely like I can always hear it. Like I can hear it right now, and it's just uh, it's a constant ringing in the ears. I've heard people experimenting with it, but I haven't heard anything really solid on it as far as a treatment. But to try and come up with a destructive sound wave that would cancel out the tinnitus. If you could, or tinnitus, however you say it, but anyway, so that you could basically cancel out that ringing by having the opposite ringing coming into your ears. That'd be wonderful. Um, I don't know if there's been any real progress on that, but I would love there to be. But yes, very different than Schrodinger's cat, which is, in my opinion, one of the reasons that I think not everything about quantum mechanics is bunk, but that kind of interpretation I think is. Um, and the funny thing is, Schrodinger's cat was actually a proposition put forth to try to mock superpositional states and collapsing waveforms and stuff, and how stupid the idea was, because the cat is clearly not alive and dead at the same time. The cat is either alive or dead. You having observed it doesn't change that. Now, the one of the big problems with that is that we start with the idea that you can when you're talking about particles, particular extremely tiny particles like quarks, electrons, that at that scale, observing observing the particle um, actually disturbs the particle itself, because the only way to observe something is to basically shine a light on it, right? So you shine a light on it so you can see it, right? If you have no light, you can't observe it. And the problem is the photons from the light will actually interact with the particle and change the particle's velocity and or trajectory. And so you can't and at present we can't predict how that disturbance will take place. So we can only say, well, there's a good chance it'll do that, and this is what quantum mechanics does. But quantum mechanics is just laying the odds, where it says, okay, there's a 75% it's going to hit here, but there's like a 10% chance it'll hit here, and like a 3% chance it'll hit here, and then you get way over here, and it's like a 0.00000001% chance. Um, but then we get some of the dumb things about quantum mechanics, which is that we try to take, and this is again, we understand the principle that quantum mechanics can only predict the probability of something happening. And so then they say, well, that means that since, uh, for example, if you throw a object against the wall, it's going to bounce off the wall, right? But there's this minute possibility. If you throw a single particle at the wall, there's a minute possibility that the particle will just go through the wall, as opposed to being stopped by the particles in the wall. And so then they say, well, if we extrapolate that out, there's actually a chance every time you throw that ball against the wall, there's a chance that the ball go right through the wall one of these times. Except that never, ever, ever happens. And so what you're trying to extrapolate something that honestly doesn't work in the real world. Instead, and then we get to this little thing. Okay, so if in fact, so like we talk about Schrodinger's cat. So if you cannot observe the cat, but you know the cat is in a box and there is a particle in the box has a half life of 1 hour, and you wait an hour, that means there's a 50% chance that that particle is degraded. And if the particle degraded, then it releases a poison that kills the cat. So you don't know if the cat is alive or dead until you open the box and observe it. And so, therefore, the cat is both alive and dead until you observe it, except that that's where I say it's total BS. The cat is either alive or dead. You just don't know the answer until you observe it. However, mathematically, if you were running calculations based on the cat, uh, mathematically, you would have to assume the cat is both alive and dead until you could observe the cat. And so that way you can calculate, well, if the cat's alive, this will happen. If the cat is dead, this will happen, and you can come up with your fairly accurate predictions of what would happen in either case. But you're just because you have to assume that to do the math, that the cat is both alive and dead, it doesn't mean that the cat is literally both alive and dead at the same time. It just means that we don't know. And it's the same thing like when I get upset about when we talk about evolution. I have no problem with the theory of evolution being the best explanation for the diversity of life forms on this planet. Now, evolution doesn't explain the beginning of life on this planet, and there are some things about life that it doesn't explain. Maybe it will eventually. Doubt it, but maybe it will. And this is where people got into like the whole God of the Gaps thing, right? If we talk about God of the Gaps, the idea that, oh, well, you thought God did this, but then we found the natural process. Well, but God's behind that. Well, you thought so, but we found the natural process behind that. And you see, you were just making your God smaller and smaller and smaller because, where science is explaining so much. And God of the Gaps is an interesting idea, except that it doesn't describe the Christian God. It's a good way to describe, say, the pagan gods of Greco-Roman myth and stuff like that. God of the Gaps is great for that because you would have a god of lightning. Well, we find out lightning is actually caused by something else, and we have a god of everything. There's a god for everything in their pantheon. Well, those are typical gods of the gaps, right? Those are gods that explain things that we just don't know what the answer is. So it would be like me saying that, well, God directly, uh, causes every mutation that happens in evolution. And so therefore, God guides evolution, right? But then we find out, oh, well, here's the triggering mechanism for the mutations, and it's something totally different, right? And I was like, well, God created that or whatever. I don't bother with that. I just know that I'm fairly comfortable with my position that God is the foundation of everything that there is. Now, what the idea of science is to explore the universe and uncover the closest secondary cause to God that we can. And so if science should always look for another explanation. We should always, but the point of science is not to disprove God. In fact, many of the greatest scientists in history have all been theists, but and many scientists today are still theists, even though most of them are closeted at this point. But a scientist is simply trying to get as close as possible to the root cause of everything. And in the case of whether you're talking about evolution or you're talking about the cosmos or whatever you're talking about, it doesn't mean that you say, you throw up your hand and say, well, God did it. Guess I don't have to explore anymore. That's one thing that commonly, in a common criticism of Christianity is atheists will say, well, Christians just say God did it and they don't care about exploring. No, well, if that were true, then science as we know it wouldn't exist, because most of the foundations of our modern science all came from people who were devout Christians. And, Galileo was a devout Christian. Um, as was Newton, as was, most of the great thinking minds of the past were. And many of them would cite things like the idea is to understand God, or to understand his creation, or to worship God by understanding his creation. And I have no problem with any of that. Um, and if you're just an atheist just trying to seek the truth, I don't really have a problem with that either, as long as you're open minded about it. Um, but when it comes to and so so there's nothing inherently Christian about just throwing your hands up and say God did it, right? Like, currently the Big Bang is pretty much the accepted model for the origin of the universe as we know it. Now, does that mean God caused the Big Bang directly? That's what most Christians will say. I've even said that a few times, but I don't think that's a fair assessment. God is ultimately behind it all. Did he trigger the Big Bang specifically, or did he do something else that caused something else that caused something else that caused the Big Bang? We don't know. And so, just because, as a theist, I may believe that the ultimate cause of the Big Bang is God, doesn't mean that if I were a cosmologist, I would not be trying like heck to figure out if there was a mechanical process to the Big Bang that we could actually calculate. The problem is we can't right now. But we also have to figure in or factor in the fact that just because humans don't know or even can't know something doesn't mean there's not an answer. So that's where I get mad at the idea of like random mutations being cited in evolution, because random is an unwarranted assumption. Now, it would be just as unwarranted to say they're guided, but we don't know. We just know that there are mutations and there's natural selection, and that's the mechanism for evolution. But as far as the mutations being random in nature, no, we could say that we cannot predict them. Right? As of right now, humans do not have the ability to predict what mutations will occur. However, to suggest they're random is to suggest a atheistic worldview. To suggest that they're guided would be to suggest a theistic worldview, and science should ultimately be agnostic. Music by Brian says God of the Gap's response to an argument from apologists. If it doesn't explain the Christian God, Christian apologists ought to stop using the precursor to the rebuttal as an argument. Well, the problem is, I think, and in modern apologetics and counter apologetics, is that God of the Gaps is frequently cited uh, inappropriately, um, and I think that dishonestly by both sides, because God of the Gaps is not an effective explanation of a capital G creator God. God of the Gaps is a great way to explain lowercase g pantheon gods. But it does not explain a creator God in any way, shape, or form. But people want to use that because it seems like a quick hand wave explanation to you and say, you see, you're full of crap because you just believe in God of the Gaps, because whatever science can't explain, you just say God did it. But if that's what somebody is saying, then they're just woefully ignorant. Or, as mathematician and Oxford professor John Lennox would say, God is not the God of the gaps, he's the God of the whole show. I think that just like you don't want to apply all irrational arguments to all Christians, you have to acknowledge that many extheans certainly mean Christians, do make those arguments, and that's what the responses exist for. I understand that, but I also am tired of atheists only going for low hanging fruit. Because if you want to say, you're, like I'm sure I don't know if you've been around YouTube a long time, Music by Brian, but there used to be this feud between Thunderfoot who was an atheist, and a kid named Venifang X, who was a young Earth creationist. And Thunderfoot would constantly, and he did this at nauseum to where I haven't watched this channel in years. I don't know what he's doing these days, but I assume he's still around. But he would always basically show things like like Westboro Baptist Church, and all these various young Earth creationists, and say how normative that is of Christianity, and in fact that if you don't believe in this stuff, that you're not really a Christian. And that's the kind of argument that I take umbrage to from atheists, is the idea that I have to believe a very specific brand of theism in order to claim to be a Christian, when that's not what even the Bible says. That's just what some people have interpreted it as. And so just because I'm not a member of the Westboro Baptist Church doesn't mean I'm not a Christian. Just like, and there are many atheists that I have a lot of respect for and all that. My only problem with atheists is when they basically want to, you know, for example, an argument that miracles don't exist is that miracles don't happen, therefore miracles don't exist. That's not an argument. Um, and so, or the argument that God doesn't exist. Well, I don't see him. Okay. But the problem is that there, and I would love to ask you, since you seem like an intelligent atheist, let me ask you, Music by Brian, is there an argument for atheism? And if so, what is it? Solitaire, a pastor a while back I listened to said Moses was a scientist. Also, he studied nature and animals. Well, there's actually, it's kind of funny because it wasn't Moses, but there is, in fact, a great example of what do you call it? A double blind research study in the Old Testament, where basically, gosh, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was. Um, Not Joseph, I don't think. I'm trying to. My brain is escaping me there. But anyway, so somebody was saying they were saying they couldn't eat the food of the locals, and so they conducted a blind experiment where they would feed some people their food and other people other food, and to test to see if there was any adverse effects of eating their prescribed diet, and so that way they could stick to their religious beliefs on food. When you say something like God of the gaps, rebuttal fails to address the Christian God, you're a strong man in, by the way, because the God of the gaps rebuttal does address the argument it's rebutting. I'm not 100% sure what you mean there. Um, I'm straw manning in a way because the God of the gaps rebuttal does address the argument it's rebutting. What am I strawmanning? Because God of the gaps, the concept of God of the gaps is simply that um, is to apply God to the gaps in scientific knowledge, right? That's somehow what God is, and that God is shrinking. This is the whole point of God of the gaps as scientific knowledge increases. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what God is. That's why I think it's a poor argument to use, because it doesn't explain the Christian God at all. What happens to scientific studies Moses did is anyone's guess. Well, he wrote it on some tablets, but I heard he broke them. And he started saying, "Oh, I know Thunderfoot Venifying X. That's old lore. Thunderfoot mostly focuses on Elon Musk now. That doesn't surprise me. I mean, for a while he was attacking feminists, and he got in hot water about that. But that was the last time I watched him." Indy says Christian apologists also misapply evolution belief to atheist worldview. Atheism is simply the belief that God or gods don't exist. You're 100% correct about that. Is that I have and that's why I get really mad. But this is mostly again those young Earth creationists, the Venom Fang X type of Christians, that will try to suggest that somehow evolution is this like anti religious or anti God perspective. That Darwin one day woke up and wanted to disprove God, so he came up with, Darwinian evolution, which is a load of crap because obviously, to look at evolutionary theory, it's very, very simple. If you observe nature, you can see that over multiple generations, species tend to change. The change is generally very subtle, but over a long enough period of time, these changes could result in speciation, where if you have two isolated groups of the same species and they're allowed to stay separated from each other, they could eventually get to the point where they couldn't reproduce with each other because there wasn't significant enough change, and now you have a new species. However, I would say that evolution simply is the explanation of the process by which life diversifies. It's nothing more, nothing less than that. People make it out to be more. It is not an explanation as to where life came from. It's not meant to be any kind of deep philosophical thing. It's simply talking about diversification of life, change over time. And evolution doesn't even answer the question as to how many initial life forms may have existed, because it's a pretty safe bet that we didn't all exist from we didn't all evolve from a single microbe. And there are a number of differing beliefs on that. Like, many Christians have posited the idea that maybe God planted the different types of creatures on the earth and they've all evolved from that point. Uh, Other people think that God did literally just, hit mud puddle with lightning and that caused life to spark. Whatever the truth is, we probably will never really know. But I think, at some point in the past, somehow life got started on this planet. Um, Unfortunate, and this is a big problem for. It's not a problem for science. It's a problem for atheists who try to use science. I would say, is that there's no scientific explanation as to how you get life naturally from lifelessness. It doesn't work. However, there are people that try to suggest, well, you can get some proteins if you do this and this and this. Yeah, but that's getting some proteins is a long ways from getting life. I think it depends on how you define atheism. You probably know there are two common definitions that are floating out there: lack theism, or lack of belief, or the belief that no gods exist. And I would say this. So here's how, just so you know, music, because as far as I know, it's the first time we've really talked. Here's how, just so you know, understand terms. I personally, I think that the lack theism uh, definition that many modern atheists use is a cop out. I think it's a way to try to avoid having to defend their position. Because that way they can say they don't have a position to defend. But if you don't have a position, then you shouldn't be in the debate at all. You do have a position, you just don't want to defend it. I'm not saying you, I'm saying atheists that take the lack theism position. Now, I would also understand that the belief that no gods exist, rubs some atheists the wrong way because they want to say that they're all about scientific knowledge, not about belief, right? However, even though there's some truth to that statement, I understand why some atheists find it offensive. So here's how I define the terms very, very simply: theism is the assumption that God or gods exist. Atheism is the assumption that God or gods do not exist. You don't have to say prove, you don't have to say believe, you just have to say you live your life assuming that God does not exist if you're an atheist. That is 100% true. Right? And this also makes it so that we can clarify the air. Like, remember, since you know Thunderfoot, as you might remember, Bionic Dance. She and I got into it a few times in the past. I don't know if she's still around either, but Bionic Dance, another hard um, atheist out there, and one of her big things that she would say over and over and over is all babies are atheists. Why? Because babies lack a belief in God. The problem with the lack of belief in God being the definition, um, of what an atheist is, and I've thrown this right in her face, and it really pissed her off, but it didn't bother me much. But if you want to say that simply lacking a belief in God is the definition of atheism, then that means that this microphone, this cup, every inanimate object that exists, not to mention my dog, are all atheists because they lack belief in God. So if atheism means literally everything that's not a theist, then that's a pretty stupid and generic term. It lacks explanatory power, if you might say. However, if you simply say that atheists assume that there are no gods and theists assume that there are, I don't think there's anything controversial about that, because you may not say I don't know that God doesn't exist. Yes, but you live your life assuming that He doesn't. God of the Gaps is a rebuttal to the Christian apologist argument that science can't answer X, therefore God. Well, except that that's generally, I mean, here's the problem: science can't answer X, therefore God is not a Christian apologetic. It's a straw man of a Christian apologetic that many atheists put forward. But I have yet to hear, I mean, outside of maybe someone who is intellectually deficient, I have yet to hear any serious Christian try to say, well, science can't explain this, therefore God. All right? Science can't define love, therefore God. Science can't explain where the Big Bang came from, therefore God. Now, you can take some of these things as evidence as far as the limitations of science. Like, I don't think that science can understand where the Big Bang came from. But the only, and I'm not saying there's no overlapping magisterium like some people. I'm simply saying that that to simply say, well, science can't do this, therefore God, is not a genuine Christian apologetic argument. Now, you can take things like the Kalam cosmological argument and say, okay, if you want, you would boil it down to science can't explain the beginning of the universe, therefore God. Well, I think that now you're getting to an actual thing that is more or less at the crux of where the overlapping magisterium of science and religion do cross, and that is the origin of all things, right? Obviously, the biblical answer is in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The scientific answer, the honest truth is, don't know, right? We don't have currently a consensus as to what caused the universe. There are varying ideas ranging from unlikely to downright ludicrous, depending on who you listen to. You have people like Hawking and oh gosh, what's his name that wrote the universe without a beginning? I don't remember. But anyway, the Krauss. Hawking and Krauss both believe that the laws of scientific theory themselves could cause the universe to be self-created, except that that is absolutely ludicrous to when you start thinking about it. The laws of physics will tell you exactly what will happen if a cue ball hits the 8 ball. The laws of physics do not cause the cue ball to hit the 8 ball. And so the laws of physics can explain how different things within the universe work. They might eventually be able to explain how the Big Bang process worked and all that stuff, but they do not cause it to happen. All science is an explanation of that which has happened. It is not a causal agent. And then you have, like things like the multiverse hypothesis and stuff, to which there is no evidence. But besides the fact that there's no evidence, it also confounds the problem. You know, if we look at something like Occam's razor, whatever solution creates the least assumptions, then is generally the better one, right? That's one of the reasons I don't like random in my evolutionary theory, because that's an assumption that is unnecessary. When we look at the multiverse theory, well, now you're saying the explanation for the universe is an infinite number of universes. So you've literally created an infinite number of assumptions in order to explain it. That's, to me, the antithesis of a good theory. But, that's just me. Multiverses are fun for sci-fi, though. I hit subscribe. I have to say, I rarely hear the discussion to be either civil or intellectually honest. Well, I appreciate that. Robert says, I don't believe any kind of evolution myself. Genetic manipulation, yes, just like a mule comes from a horse breeding with a donkey. Mules are sterile, also. Well, that's actually part of, like, when we look at speciation, Robert, um, the thing about mules is mules are actually not a separate species by the strict definition of the words from horses or donkeys because mules are sterile. Because in order for a species to come about, it has to be genetically distinct from its predecessor and unable to reproduce with its predecessor, but also able to reproduce with others of its own group. And so, if you, a mule is not a separate species, but, obviously a donkey is a separate species from a horse. And the thing is, the reason they're a separate species is because they can't produce fertile offspring. However, I would say this: um, you do believe in some kinds of evolution, Robert. You probably believe in what, and the funny thing is, it's really a nonsensical term, but it's one that theists use and most people understand. Is you would believe in microevolution, the idea that you can change small characteristics about a thing, but that there's a limit, right? So, for example, you can a single wolf could over time evolve into the hundreds of different AKC recognized species of dog, right? From the Chihuahua to the Great Dane and everything in between, even though they're really not different species, they're just breeds within it. But wolves, dogs, foxes, all canines could have evolved from a singular source. However, a dog will never eventually become a turtle or a horse or a chicken or whatever. That's kind of where this line of argumentation tends to go, is that all canines will give birth to other canines, even if those other canines become eventually new species of canine. And the same thing, all horses and all or quadrupeds, if you will. You could even make it more general: all mammals, all fish. And I can understand some of the logic in that, but at the same time, you're still accepting evolution. You're just not. You're just saying, but there's a limit. Like you don't like I will say, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but I will say I have some problems in like how did we go from asexual to sexual reproduction? That seems like kind of a big evolutionary step and would have to happen all at once. What about from um, egg laying to live birth, or cold blooded to warm blooded? Some of these things seem like there's not really a happy middle. And so I don't know how you explain some of that stuff. I'm sure some of it has explanations, but I'm not an evolutionary biologist. Right, understand what you're saying, and you do, you know who Bionic Dance was. I don't know if she's still around, but yeah, she's something. I find a lot of online atheists cringy as F, almost as cringy as online theists. I would say that online atheists and online theists both tend to bring their share of the cringe when they come in with an express purpose of trying to disprove uh, uh, like atheists that say, "Oh, I can prove that." Like, oh man, there's a guy. His name was Dorpitan. He was hilarious. I don't know if he's still around, but he was absolutely hilarious. He was like the gave the most absurd arguments for atheism that I ever heard. Like, for example, the actual argument from Dorpitan: God is, according to Christians, God created everything that exists. Therefore, God is not something that is within that subset of everything that exists. Therefore, God does not exist. Brilliant. And I have not taken any offense to anything you've said so far. Yuri Minkishi, I think I'm saying that right, says, no, I'm an agnostic atheist. I believe all organized religions are wrong, and the idea of God itself cannot be proven nor disproven. But you can still live and pray or believe in God, in my opinion. Well, I would say this: if you, so if the answer to the question, is there a God? If your gut reaction answer is no, you're an atheist. If your gut reaction is yes, you're a theist. If your gut reaction is I don't know, then you're an agnostic. But being a true agnostic is a very difficult thing to maintain. Most people, because you live your life either in the assumption that God does or does not impact it in some way. Um, and I would suggest this. Um, if you believe that God is possible, I mean, I'm assuming you do based on your position. If you believe God is possible, then I think it is an extraordinary act of hubris to suggest that you can say that all organized religions are wrong. Because you would have to know, you know. Music by Brian says Christians absolutely say things like science can't explain love, therefore God. For a little background, my professor in college is Dr. Paul Copen. He taught me apologetics while I was still Christian. I'm not saying Christians don't say it. I'm saying serious Christians don't say it, in debate. Like, you would never hear William Lane Craig say, you can't explain love, therefore God. That's not even a logical argument, right? Because a logical argument would mean that the conclusion must follow the premises, right? So if you say premise one, science cannot explain God, conclusion, therefore God, right? It doesn't even follow, right? Now you could say that, if God is love, right, as the Bible says, but the Bible, when it says God is love, doesn't mean God is literally composed of love. But if God is love, love exists, science can't explain love, therefore God. I mean, that's like the closest I could come up with. I think you're misunderstanding what Krauss said in his book, no offense. Well, Krauss gives several arguments in his book, and that he keeps backpedaling because he knows that his own arguments are full of crap. The problem is you cannot explain the existence of the universe. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you should have to, because at this point, scientists are trying to figure out a logical way for the universe to exist. But to suggest that the universe came from nothing, which is, what Krauss is trying to suggest. And of course, I know that sometimes people try to explain that nothing doesn't really mean nothing, but that's what nothing means. But nothing is actually not nothing, it's something, blah, blah, blah. Um, but the problem is that the initial state of existence for time, space, matter, and energy is one of those things that currently there's no scientific explanation for, except to say that we have a pretty good idea of when it happened. Um, and when I was an atheist, I didn't like that, but I could accept it. Nowadays, it seems like atheists, particularly atheist physicists like Krauss and Hawking before him, are trying to come up with ways to come up with the existence of the universe from nothing that don't involve a God, in order to therefore say, oh, see, no God, because I came up with a way for it to happen. But so far, I haven't seen a logically consistent argument for the existence of the universe without God. Now, don't get me wrong. Again, I think that the problem is that a lot of these people are going outside of their own wheelhouse. You're getting into the realm of philosophy and stuff more than science when you start talking about, because there's no way to predict anything prior to the Big Bang, because we can't even go back to the Big Bang. We can get close to it, but and I'm sure you already know this. We can get close to it, but we can't get to it, right? We because everything that we know about physics and everything breaks down by the time when you get close enough to the actual event, which means that our understanding of physics is obviously incomplete. If we ever do get a 100% accurate picture of the universe through mathematical equations and everything, which I doubt will ever happen, but if we actually did, then maybe we could predict what the Big Bang was initially like, and therefore start to speculate about what caused it from a scientific perspective. But whenever a scientist tries to write explanations for the universe without God, it just means they're trying to fulfill an agenda, because there is no scientific explanation for the universe without God, because there's no scientific explanation for the universe at all, because we'd have to get past the Big Bang in order to get there. I think it would be more productive to look for a scientific explanation for the beginning of life than the beginning of the universe. Because at least with the beginning of life, we understand evolution well enough. We understand geologic evolution as far as the Earth well enough. So now we can try to figure out a way that life could have sparked naturally, although so far hasn't happened. You just caught us on a good day. Uh, 67 mango skibbity toilet mustard. Okay, Yuri. Not sure what that's supposed to mean. Well, I'm going to go watch Breakfast Taco stream for an hour or so, and I think it's going to be a ridiculous conversation for both sides. I don't know Breakfast Tacos, but hopefully it's a good conversation. Indy says dolphins were once land dwelling creatures, much like a cow 40 million years ago, according to the fossil record. Um, Now, I don't know the specifics on dolphin evolution. I do know that many of the sea mammals have vestigial skeletal structures that could indicate that they were once land animals. I don't know about the fossil record corroborating that. I genuinely don't know. I'll plead ignorance to that. Um, However, let's assume that there were once dolphin cows 40 million years ago. Um, Great. There were dolphin cows 40 million years ago. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you're. I know you, Indy, and you're not trying to be a jerk about it. But I think that's something that Christians have a difficult time with sometimes, is to understand that humanity has only been on Earth for even the most liberal of scientists like Dawking will say maybe 100 to 200,000 years, but civilization as we know it really about 5,000 years, and so humanity has only been on the earth a blink of an eye compared to the age of the earth. And so that's one of that's just the way it is. But some Christians have a difficult time accepting that, even though there's nothing about that inherently contradicts scripture, even Genesis 1. If you have questions about asexual to sexual reproduction, you should study it. It all has explanations. It's far better to understand it yourself than to question it without studying first. Well, like I said, I'm just saying that's a question that I have. It's not something that I dwell on. Um, as far as evolution is concerned, my only beef with the theory is when people try to say random. That's it. Or if people try to say evolution explains life, it doesn't. It explains diversity. I watched a video the other day. Bionics are real, though not in the Bionic Man level. Not yet. The video is about a young lady that had two bionic forearms and hands. That's cool. But yeah, bionic dance, definitely not bionic in that sense. I mean, a bunch of crazy things that we know are definitely wrong can be possible. Is it possible that humans originated from secret society on the moon from a billion years ago? Yes, but that's wrong. Yeah, I'm not sure what the point. If you're asking, because when I was saying if you believe God is possible, yes, I would say if you think that a theistic God is in fact possible, then I think it's arrogant and hubris to say that all religions are wrong unless you know all religions. And I don't think there's a single human being on earth that actually knows all religions, right? And I wouldn't even go so far as because I don't consider myself religious. I'm a Christian, but I don't consider, like I'm a non sectarian Christian. So I don't follow a set of doctrines written by people after the fact. Um, and I think that that's a fundamental thing to understand. Forearms, I meant stupid. Yeah, I get it. Um, I'm going to head out, but it's been a good conversation. Maybe we can get deeper into some of these topics someday. Have a good one, brother. You take it easy, music. Um, and Indy is also going to breakfast. Talk to you later. And so, with that, since we just have Stan Lee left here, well, I'm not going to sit around.